Welcome back to Cine Recaps. Today, I'm going to break down a tense survival thriller film released in 2025 called Turbulence. Spoilers ahead, watch carefully. After an important work meeting, CEO Zach relaxes at an office party. The moment is interrupted when Hans, a former employee, storms in and angrily confronts Zach. He's furious that longtime workers were fired even though they helped build the company from nothing. Desperate, Hans offers to return for a lower salary, but Zach refuses and sends him away. Hans then pulls out a gun and calls Zach a liar. Zach begs him to calm down, saying the people there are his friends and mentioning his wife's recent miscarriage. Overcome, Hans takes his own life, spraying blood across Zach's face. Shortly after, Zach calls his wife Emmy to apologize for not spending enough time with her and tells her he loves her. Later that night, Zach is at a bar when he hears Julia arguing with the bartender. He buys her a drink to calm things down, and they talk for a while. Zach shares that he has great plans with Emmy the next day. When he notices Julia flirting, he shuts it down and says he loves his wife. The next day, Zach and Emmy leave for a vacation. During the drive, Zach gets a message from an unknown number saying, "I really enjoyed last night." Confused, he asks who it is. The sender hints that Emmy could find out and demands $500,000 to stay quiet. The final message includes a link with Julia's name. Zach replies that his lawyers will handle it.
It's amazing.
That night at the hotel, Zach opens the door for room service and thinks he sees someone watching him, but the person disappears. He keeps receiving messages from Julia, but ignores them to have dinner with Emmy. Later, he tries to get intimate, but she isn't ready. The next day, they meet Harry, who will take them on a hot air balloon ride. As Harry explains the rules, another client arrives, and Zach is shocked to see Julia. She introduces herself as if they've never met, and Zach plays along. The booking was for 2 people, but Julia says her friend couldn't come. Uncomfortable, Zach pretends he feels sick and wants to leave, but Emmy thinks he's just scared and convinces him to stay. Once everyone is placed in separate corners, the balloon lifts off. Using the noise, Zach asks Julia what she's doing there. She says if he sends the money now, they can enjoy the ride. As they rise higher, the group is amazed by the views and the sense of freedom.
Wow.
Yeah.
Control, flight acknowledged. Just be aware of cloud
Harry
formation.
contacts air traffic control and is warned about clouds to the east. Julia asks Zach if he recognizes her, and Emmy gets curious, but Zach says Julia is confused. Harry pulls out champagne and opens it with a knife from his belt. After a toast, the women chat. Emmy asks Julia about her job, and Julia says she collects debts, calling it credit control for a private bank. Sensing tension, Harry distracts them by talking about the scenery and how flying helps people escape their problems. He shares that he served in the Navy and started flying balloons after retiring. He jokes about getting paid, and Julia laughs loudly, making things awkward. Harry starts singing, and the echo makes his voice sound incredible. He gets Emmy to try, and she lets out a short, freeing scream. Julia tries too, but makes strange noises that make everyone uncomfortable.
Right. That's original.
After a pause, Julia says it's time for photos and takes several of the couple and one of Harry. While Emmy takes a selfie with Harry, Zach asks Julia if she's enjoying herself. She says it's better than the other night and asks him to take a picture of her with Harry. When Zach grabs her phone, he sees a message that reads, "Pay the money or live to regret it." Soon, the balloon drifts dangerously close to the mountains, and Harry quickly increases altitude to avoid a collision.
Jeez. Was worried there for a minute.
Always in control.
Julia warns Zach that he needs to deal with this situation soon, while Emmy demands to know what's going on. Sensing the rising tension, Harry tells everyone to calm down and enjoy the scenery. When Emmy presses again, a bird suddenly swoops over her head. It terrifies her. Though she isn't harmed, Harry becomes excited, explaining it was a golden eagle, so rare that it's considered a sign of good luck. Irritated, Julia tells Harry to turn the balloon around. He explains that landing in the mountains isn't possible and that the only way back is to ride the air currents, meaning they still have about half an hour. Julia then turns back to Zach and brings up the drink he bought her the other night. When he continues to deny everything, Julia tells Emmy she knows they haven't been intimate since she lost the baby. Cornered, Zach admits he went out for a few drinks, but insists nothing else happened. Emmy is hurt that he shared that moment with a stranger, and Julia responds that she wasn't a stranger because Zach slept with her. He denies it immediately, so Julia mentions his initials on his socks and his birthmark, lifting his shirt to prove it. Emmy believes her, while Zach continues to deny the accusation. Harry tries to calm everyone down, but Zach snaps at him with harsh language. Emmy then asks Zach why Julia is even there. Zach admits he had a drink with Julia and explains she's been following him to extort money. He claims she likely learned about the birthmark from photos online. As the argument continues, Harry notices an alarm on his device and opens a vent because they're flying too high. Julia tells him to stop, and when he refuses, she grabs his knife and declares that Zach won't escape this. Harry tries to radio for help, but Julia cuts the communication wires. The balloon keeps climbing, and Harry warns that if he can't fix it, they'll run out of oxygen and die. Emmy also realizes how high they are and begs Julia to let Harry repair the problem. When Harry reaches for the rope, Julia tries to stop him, and Zach uses the moment to tackle her. Harry joins in, and together they hold Julia over the edge of the basket, trying to disarm her. The balloon shakes violently during the struggle, and Julia begins coughing. Zach is distracted, giving her the chance to pull him off balance. She then grabs a long tool and attacks again. The men push her back against the basket, and Zach slams her wrist against the edge until she drops the knife. Emmy helps her remove her jacket and wraps her in a blanket. Harry grabs the fire extinguisher and puts out the flames. While Zach turns away. Thick black smoke rises from the balloon, and ash begins falling into the basket. The balloon keeps ascending, and Harry needs to open the vent, but the fire has burned away half the rope. With no other option, he carefully climbs onto the edge of the basket to reach what remains. Still too high, he stands on his toes and finally grabs it. As Harry begins opening the vent, Julia grabs his pants in an attempt to stop him, but instead pushes him out of the basket. He falls to his death. Zach screams at Julia, who insists it was an accident. The alarm sounds again, warning that oxygen levels are dangerously low. Feeling dizzy, Emmy spots the knife on the floor and tries to grab it, but crouching makes her lightheaded. She rushes to the edge of the basket to catch more air, calming herself despite being terrified by the drop below. When she turns back, she sees that Julia has collapsed. Desperate to bring the balloon down, Emmy searches Harry's bag and finds a strap. She carefully climbs onto the edge of the basket. Zach tries to help her, but the lack of oxygen causes him to collapse as well. Moving slowly, Emmy climbs onto the burner, gripping tightly to avoid falling. Leaning dangerously over the basket, she reaches for the rope, but passes out from the lack of air. Her body starts to slide, and she nearly falls, but she wakes just in time to save herself. Finally able to reach the rope, she opens the vent, and the balloon begins descending. She ties the strap to the burned rope, allowing it to be reached from the basket. Afterward, Emmy wakes Zach and checks her phone, but there's no signal.
I think we might get carried all the... So she can't talk about what happened?
We should tie her up.
Zach grabs another strap, ties Julia's hands, and stuffs a bandana in her mouth. He then insists to Emmy that Julia is lying and shows her their beach photos, proving she could have learned about the birthmark from social media. At that moment, they realize the balloon is drifting toward the mountains and they're on course to crash. They need to gain altitude, but the burner no longer works, so they have to lighten the load. The couple starts tossing out gas tanks, and as they move, they notice the fire has weakened the bottom of the basket. Emmy wants to keep one tank in case they need it later, but Zach argues that avoiding the crash matters more. Suddenly, the balloon hits the mountain and scrapes along its side. The couple fears it will be ripped apart by the sharp rocks, but it keeps moving, and they narrowly escape. Once they're clear, Zach checks the balloon and finds a hole in it. Emmy gives Julia some water, and another argument is about to start when the balloon passes through a thick cloud. While Emmy tries to track their direction, Zach asks Julia why she chose him. As Julia secretly reaches for the knife, she distracts him by revealing she is Hans's daughter and blaming Zach for her father's death. Zach explains that he made a business decision and paid Hans fairly. Furious, Julia accuses him of being entitled, reminding him that Hans worked for the company for 40 years, while Zach simply inherited the wealth. Suddenly, Julia lunges at Zach and stabs him in the shoulder, forcing Emmy to pull her away. Emmy tries to calm her, offering sympathy for her father and suggesting they can say the stabbing was an accident. When Zach protests, Emmy snaps at him, furious that he can't see she's doing what it takes to survive. Julia panics again, and Emmy continues showing compassion, promising everything will be okay. Julia apologizes to Emmy for dragging her into this. Zach then takes the opportunity to strike Julia with a gas tank. She drops instantly, dead, and Emmy screams in shock, unable to believe what her husband has done. Zach says he did it to protect her before collapsing, begging for help as blood pours from his wound. Emmy finds a first aid kit and does her best to bandage him. Minutes later, she notices the hole in the balloon is widening, and they're being pushed back toward the mountains, losing altitude fast. She connects the final gas tank to the burner and presses the controls, but nothing happens. Zach demands ideas, and Emmy yells at him for not helping. As he suggests throwing Julia's body out, Emmy searches Harry's bag and finds a lighter. She covers Julia's body with a jacket, then works with Zach to reignite the burner. It finally fires up, and the balloon climbs over the mountains. After a few minutes, they realize they've gone too far and are now rising too high, so they start tossing items overboard. Emmy notices how the wind carries the objects and remembers Harry saying it could lead them home. She rushes to open the vent, and the balloon begins descending. However, it drifts dangerously close to the mountainside. Luckily, the wind curves around it, and they avoid another crash. Julia's body begins to slide, so Emmy lays it flat and covers it with a blanket. Zach insists it wasn't his fault and claims it was self-defense. Emmy fires back that none of this would have happened if he hadn't bought Julia a drink. They argue, and Zach reminds her that for months she kept refusing to go out together. Enraged, Emmy insults him and steps forward, causing the burned section of the basket to finally give way. She falls through the hole but saves herself at the last second by grabbing the edge. Zach freezes for a moment, forcing Emmy to beg him to help. He tries to pull her up, but his shoulder wound leaves him weak. Emmy slips and grabs onto a wooden plank that begins to crack. Zach throws her a strap and she catches it just before the board breaks and falls away. The strap slips from Zach's hand and he barely manages to grab it again. As the balloon drifts dangerously close to the mountain peaks, Zach wraps the strap around himself and pulls with all his strength until he finally hauls Emmy back into the basket. She demands to know why he hesitated before saving her, and Zach insists he was frozen by shock. Soon after, the balloon heads straight toward a storm. The couple realizes it's accelerating because air is escaping as the hole continues to widen. Surrounded by heavy rain and strong winds, they climb onto the burner. Zach braces himself while Emmy painfully steps on his shoulder to reach the tear. The wind violently shakes her and she nearly loses her balance, but after struggling, she grabs the torn fabric and secures it to the balloon with a strap. As Emmy climbs back down, she slips on the soaked material, and Zach barely manages to catch her. They return to the basket and ignite the burner, which fortunately pushes the balloon out of the storm. The basket clips the mountainside, causing only a small jolt before they clear it. Once they're flying over an open field, Zach checks his phone again, but still has no signal. Emmy begins wondering how Julia knew about Zach's initialed socks, since those weren't posted online. She searches Julia's body, making Zach visibly nervous, and he secretly kicks Julia's phone through the hole in the basket. Emmy then takes Zach's phone to read Julia's messages. Opening the link, she finds a video of herself and Zach getting dirty. In it, they talk about what happened at the office, and Zach insults Hans, calling him useless and saying he needed to be flushed away. Emmy questions whether Zach ever truly cared. He says he cares about having a family, but blames her for being unable to give him one. He accuses Emmy of spending months drowning in guilt and self-pity instead of getting dirty with him, and reminds her that he's given her a luxurious life. When Emmy explains she doesn't care about wealth or his irritating, pretentious friends, Zach calls her ungrateful and says that without him she'd be cleaning toilets. Emmy finally understands what kind of man he really is and announces she wants a divorce, promising to take half of the company. When Zach steps toward her and claims she can't afford to leave him, Emmy shoves him, causing him to fall through the hole. He clings to the basket and pleads for help, but loses his grip, barely saving himself by grabbing the strap. Emmy watches as he switches between begging and threatening to destroy her life. Then she makes her decision. She pushes Julia's body out of the basket, and it crashes into Zach, sending him falling to his death. Sobbing, Emmy throws away the necklace Zach gave her along with her wedding ring. Eventually, the balloon drifts over a forest, and after brushing through tree branches, lands softly on the grass. Emmy steps out, turns on the burner to set the balloon ablaze, and walks away. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to support the channel. Thank you for watching.